I've called to order tonight's meeting. We have an invocation by our county chaplain, Mr. Root. Thank you.
Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for faithfulness, for your many gifts. Air we breathe, the lungs we have to breathe it. Pray with the wisdom that you made this creation with us, that we would like as you not only to thoughts and ideas will hear others. We just pray that this would be your meeting.
Thank you. Approval of our minutes from our last meeting. We have a motion.
Move to approve?
Second.
Second. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. I believe we don't have any public comment this evening? Okay. Discussion of Chapter 38, Article 8, amendments and rezoning. Staff?
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, at the previous meeting, the last meeting we had on June 5th, 2017, Mr. Markovich, who's here in the audience today, gave a presentation on matters related to both Chapter 38 and Chapter 32, but mainly Chapter 38 in regards to our Oconee County Code of Ordinances. Just observations, improvements that were presented. As a result of that presentation, the commission had asked me to A, add both of those back onto the agenda as agenda items, and to B, discuss them, not only their applicability in code, what they're used for, but my recommendation as staff as to some of the changes that Mr. Markovich suggested. The first of which is that discussion of Chapter 38, Article 8, amendments and rezoning. And so that particular code reference, if you'd join me on the screen here, would be directly under Section 38-8. And then the full code reference, you can see it stretches out quite a bit with the 1A, in this case, 1 or 2A, etc. to conclude the chapter. There are three methods of rezoning. So the first, I'm scrolling back up to, is the plan district request. So for each planning district, you can request to rezone that entire planning district. The third is just an action by council. And the second, which we'll be discussing today, is what's referred to as small area rezoning. Mr. Markovich had essentially recommended striking most of the language in this section. It would keep the concept of small area rezoning, but it would remove some of the, for lack of a better term, burdens on an applicant to rezone their property from control-free district to another zoning district. Probably the most notable example in there is the requirement for 200 acres in order to rezone from control-free to another zoning district in our code. Also, descriptions of percentages and petitions and signatures of your neighbors to get that 200 acres. Since the Planning Commission asked me my opinion on it, particularly my opinion on striking that language, I'll give my opinion, but with a bit of a caveat leading into the next item. Control-free district is the only district that has this requirement. You know, it's almost treated as a jumping off or stepping stone from control-free to the other districts. So they're not treated equally in a sense. Control-free has this requirement for 200 acres, the other ones do not. That said, you know, the intent of that is to paint the zoning map with a broader brush to make sure that the area is rezoned from control-free to another use rather than just on a owner-by-owner basis. There are terms for rezoning for, a private property owner's benefit, which is not to the public's benefit, which is not in accordance with the comprehensive plan and the future land use map, that this 200 acres can negate because it has more people involved, and again, it paints with that broader brush. However, it just goes back to control-free is treated differently here than other zoning districts by having this requirement. So my staff recommendation is this, that if, depending on what we do with agenda item number 6, if that is the status quo, then staff's recommendation is this also remain as the status quo, that this section of code, including the 200 acres requirement, the petition requirement, and all the other requirements of small area zoning remain. That said, it's also my recommendation that zones be treated equally. So depending on what occurs and what is recommended by this board for the control-free district in regards to setbacks, that these considerations be equal throughout all zoning districts. So your alternate, or option B, is to treat zoning equally, remove this section, but also treat the control-free district as a true zoning district, which is not control-free. It has controls instituted in it. So I'm going to jump between both agenda items. I apologize, but I'll leave discussion there for both. So shown here, it's got method 2, small area rezoning. Again, my staff recommendation is to keep it as it's the status quo. We haven't encountered too many problems as staff at this time with this requirement. However, you also have the option to remove it, which highly impacts the other item for your consideration today. That is agenda item 6, discussion of Chapter 38, Article 10, zoning districts. Mr. Markovich also recommended removing setbacks in the control-free district. This originally had no setbacks, as Mr. Markovich noted. They were only recently added in 2015. The setbacks were then amended recently in fact, late 2016, to have a more of a sliding scale, so that the smaller the parcel, the less significant the setback is. So, for instance, the setback is 25 feet over half an acre. If you're under a quarter acre, it could be as little as 10 feet for a front setback, 5 and 5. In this case, and for agenda item number 6, it's staff recommendation to, again, keep the status quo, keep the setbacks in the control-free district as they are shown here. Staff feels that this idea of a sliding scale, providing relief for smaller parcels, has worked well. The issues we've had in Port Bass or other subdivisions that were created decades ago, we get a lot of applications for homes on the lake, frankly. The economy's doing pretty well, and we have yet to encounter a issue where that the home can't be accommodated on the land, can't fit on that building footprint in some way. Again, that's my staff recommendation, to keep the status quo, giving options and opinion. If it's going to be called control-free district, it should be relatively control-free. That includes setbacks. So say we're going 30 miles an hour right now, hit the brakes or go 55. Go one way or the other. So if you really want it to be control-free, and that's really the intent of this council, then get rid of setbacks. If you really want it to be a zoning district, you really want it to feel like all other zoning districts, it should remain having setbacks. It should be represented in the zoning use matrix, and it should be treated equally in every other form to another zoning district. I'll bring up another exhibit. Talked about this a couple times. The idea of changing the name of control-free district to something along the lines of general use, that would amend this code in several portions. You would change 38-10.2 to change its name. That would be reflected in not only the setbacks, but the description of the zoning district, implying that it's equal to any other residential zoning district or commercial zoning district. But most importantly, that it would be represented in the zoning use matrix, where today it is absent, implying that there are no land use controls in the control-free district. And as we discussed in the last meeting, that's not necessarily true. Communication towers need a special exception from the Board of Zoning Appeals. Something like a sexually oriented business is likely not permitted there in any form. So, again, my staff recommendation for agenda item 5 and agenda item 6 is to keep it the way it is. But you do have options if you feel that control-free needs to be control-free, then there are some things that need to be struck from code. If you would like to treat them equally, you may want to strike things in code such as 200-acre requirements that treat them differently, but you'd also have to recognize that it is a zoning district like any other. It is represented in the zoning use matrix, and it should have a name that implies that it is a true zoning district. That, I leave it open to the commission's discussion.
Anybody have any comments?
I have a question. These setbacks are for anything built, not just a house. A fence, anything, cannot be built any closer to the property line than these setbacks. Is that right?
The exact way that's close. The exact way that it's defined in code is that setbacks are in reference to a structure, and a structure is, without citing the reference, is more broadly defined as something permanent, something that's placed onto the ground. And there are specific exemptions for signage and fences within that requirement. So, broadly speaking, fences can go anywhere on the property line so long as it's not blocking, say, an access easement. So they're not subject to setbacks. Signs are not subject to setbacks, but anything considered a structure, say a home or a pool or anything else that's permanent, kind of fixed to the ground, is subject to those setback requirements.
And if we do away with them and somebody wants to build a garage within 3 inches of the easement on the main road, they can do so.
If the setbacks are struck from chapter 38, then they could build it anywhere on the property. Again, they shouldn't build it on an easement, but it's a little harder to tell.
Well, I mean, I'm talking about a road easement.
Yes.
And within 3 inches would be no setback, right?
Correct, yeah, they would be able to place it anywhere on the private property, and just adjacent to any right-of-way.
Mr. Markovich, do you have any comments? We'll get you up here one way or the other.
I understand where Greg's coming from in terms of, treating the control-free district as a zoning district like any other. That was my point. It is a district. It is unquestionably a zoning district like every other district. The setbacks, and there is a requirement in state law. I mean, you have to treat all your different zoning districts equally. They can have different regulations, but in the sense that, I mean, you could have a district that the setbacks are 0. I mean, it's still a setback. Or you could have a setback that's 100 feet or 200 feet or whatever. So when we get down into the actual numbers, the numbers become kind of insignificant. How we treat that zoning district and whether or not, that we try to apply everything to it fairly. In other words, if you can rezone out of any other district without having to have 200 acres, then you should be able to rezone out of the control-free district without having to have 200 acres. That's just pure 14th Amendment of the Constitution as equal rights in my mind. But there's other things that are coming into play here. And the one thing, and I understand why planning staff is saying, well, we haven't had any issues with the setbacks. People could build on the lake and not have any problems. Yeah, you might be able to build a single-family dwelling on the lake, but you can't build multifamily. You can't build multifamily anywhere, okay? So that is my reason, that's why I said that thing got stuffed into this zoning ordinance without much thought, because we don't have a mechanism to allow us to permit multifamily housing, aside from apartments, and we're kind of picking and choosing how we want to define apartments versus being a condo or a townhouse, because they actually have a property line going through them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, I mean, apartments are unquestionably multifamily dwellings. They may not necessarily have a property line going directly through them, but to me, that is one of the major issues. The other thing is not being discussed here is in Article 9, where it clearly says that the setbacks in the zoning do not apply to the control-free district, period. It's still there. It's never been changed. So we say that the Article 10 setbacks are a requirement, but Article 9 clearly says doesn't pertain to control-free. So what I'm trying to do, in my mind, is one, make control-free fair, as it should be. I keep hearing people say, well, anybody can rezone whenever. They can't. Some people can, or if you're able to get your neighbors to help you, you might. And you might not. And you might have somebody come in and rezone you into something different than you would like to be. That's happened already. So, it's a complicated issue. There's no question about it. But I don't see how those setbacks affect how somebody's using that land when we've had that land like that for 200 and something years. How is all of a sudden having a setback on control-free changing what we're doing? How many land disputes and building disputes have we had in this county in the last 200 years because somebody built something right up beside the property line? I don't know of any. So that thing came into being because planning staff at the time was having difficulty with how they interpreted the language of an ordinance that got changed and left out some very important language when it got changed. We went back and we fixed that language. And to me, with the language fix and also adding in what my interpretation of a vested right is, I really don't see the need to have that setback requirement in there. That's it. I'm happy to answer any questions, but it really is about equal protection. And it's also because it just doesn't make sense the way the thing is written. To me, it doesn't make any sense at all. And it's also, even though we haven't permitted any multifamily, that doesn't mean you're not going to get a multifamily permit request for tomorrow. And you're going to continue to have to go back on projects like Casta where they had to come in here and get a variance. And like I said, the Zoning Board of Appeals can keep granting variances, but sooner or later, they're going to have to justify the fact that these properties are not individually distinct like they say they are. If somebody comes in and wants to rezone the adjacent property for the same reason, it kind of does away with this idea that that property was different, and that's why they needed the variance request. 80% of the property in this county is control-free. How can you make the argument that it's different? I don't know. That's it. But if you got any questions, I'm happy to.
What you're saying, Tom, is we need to do one of two things. Either change section 9, change that totally, or to read whatever, or take the setbacks out and leave that alone, and then everything's, would be right then, right?
Yeah, if you took the setbacks out, it would put things back the way that they were, and you could actually pull a multifamily permit in this county. Leave it like it is, you haven't done anything to fix multifamily. Nothing.
But we leave it like it is, it's contradicting itself, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, right now. In fact, I would argue that if somebody come in and challenged it, who can say what the judges would say? But I'm pretty sure exempt is a stronger language than 5 feet. But that's up to the judges. So, you know, but yeah, you definitely have a conflict. There's no question about that. But yeah, usually exempt means pretty strong language. Anyway.
Mr. Markovich?
Yeah.
The last meeting, you had talked about not only the setbacks, but you'd also mentioned that in the small area rezoning, it talked about the 200 acres, whereas no other zoning area had some acreage type requirement to it.
Right.
Do you see that number, if that number was addressed in some way, that would more assist in solving this?
I don't see what it has to do with rezoning. I understand why when they brought in this particular type of concept of zoning the county, there was an intention or hope that they could rezone. That was like they wanted to say, well, this control-free is just an initial zoning district that is meant to change to something else. Well, according to state law, you have to treat all the zoning districts equally. So, you know, whether or not it was supposed to just only be initial, I don't know. But I agree with the idea that they wanted to be able to come in and rezone large amounts of parcels at the same time. Now, that in of itself can create an issue from a legal standpoint. And it comes down to, it didn't happen here, but I'm not saying that it couldn't happen here. And this is where you gotta be careful when it comes to rezoning. This is gonna get legal. It's all legal. Anyway, let's say you had, as we did up near Kiwi Key, we had over 1,000 parcels come in one rezoning. 1,000 parcels. Let's say one person, and it's their right, decides to challenge that rezoning. He has to go back, as a requirement of law, as a procedure, and he has to notice every individual party that is a part of that rezoning. He would have to notice 1,000 people. Now, to serve them alone would cost him $50,000 just to give them the first notice. It's a bit of an overreach. Now, there are certain situations, and the courts have already settled that, because the question came up on an initial rezoning by a county. And they said, well, what happens there? And the courts have already said, in the situation where a county is initially rezoning, that rule doesn't apply. But after that initial zoning has been done, and you're coming back and rezoning, that rule does apply. And it played out in Charleston, in a case down there that had to do with the College of Charleston and the rezoning of some areas around there, and it was a big protest. And anyway, that's where the case comes from. But that's just, you know, one of the points. By changing that language, it doesn't mean that several people couldn't get together and decide to rezone at the same time. And in that situation, they would all be doing it voluntarily. And so it would be unlikely that one of them that is voluntarily rezoning would come back and want to challenge the decision of the council. So it's not as likely to happen in that situation. But it could easily happen if you get caught up in a rezoning and it's not of your choice, and you decide you need to challenge it. Now, all of a sudden, you're faced with a huge, huge, huge legal bill. You're not just having to notice one person. Mr. Root might want to speak to that, I don't know. But I mean, that was how I've read the different cases that have been involved in this. There's been some cases in Charleston, some cases in Hilton Head. And so, anyway. So that's part of my reasoning why it's not fair for these big expanded acreages to come in. To be honest, if it were me, I'd get rid of the initial the initial method by district. Nobody's ever used it and nobody ever will, because nobody's going to be able to meet that requirement of getting 15 or 20% of all those people that are living in a district. And it's big numbers, and that's never going to happen. So that piece of ordinance is on the books, never going to be used. Anyway,
Thank you.
yeah.
Oh. If it's against the state law for us to treat any zones differently, and the control-free district is a zone, is not our discriminatory law about not being able to return to control-free a violation of state law?
In my mind, you wouldn't be treating it differently in the sense that the only thing, and I don't even want to go there, the only thing that would still be treating it differently is that once you've rezoned out of it, you can't rezone back to it. That would be treating it differently. As I said last time, I'm not even going to go down that road. We'll let the court sort that out. If it ever gets challenged. It may never get challenged. But the only reason the 200 acre rule hadn't been challenged yet, nobody's wanted to take that bite of the apple. I assure you, if it didn't cost a lot of money, somebody would have already challenged that. But it costs a lot of money to sue the county. And generally speaking, until a law is challenged, until an ordinance is challenged, it's technically legal. So, doesn't mean it's right. Slavery in this country was legal for a very long time. Didn't make it right, just was. Got overturned eventually. Hopefully this will eventually be overturned. It's just not fair. I don't see any, I just don't see any other way around it. It's just, anybody that's got more than 200 acres can come in here and just apply for rezoning. And that's it. That's all they have to do is have 200 acres. If you got less than 200 acres, you don't have that right. That's wrong. Just flat out wrong.
But that's only control-free to another district. The 200 acres does not apply if they want to go from
That's any initial rezoning.
residential to lake residential.
No, because they've already initially
Right,
rezoned.
that's what I'm saying. So it only applies if they're going from control-free to another zone.
That's exactly right.
They can do anything else within the other zones without the 200 acres.
But, except they cannot rezone into control-free.
Right.
Thank you, Tom. Mr. Root, do you have any comment?
Out there, I think that, without going into the hypothetical, the equal protection argument, I think underlined a lot of what Tom was saying, and it's not as simple, I guess, as just saying, all right, this class has been divided up and one group is being treated, they're a similar group of folks, one group is similarly to another. We have tiers of scrutiny on an equal protection challenge. If you have a group of people who are talking about just people, we're going to treat African American people different than Caucasian people. That type of scrutiny a court is going to apply to that equal protection challenge is a much higher tier than what they're going to apply to even the gender. And at the bottom tier is something like this: business, economic, social. What they apply to government action in this tier, the bottom tier, is a irrationality test. So if the government has a legitimate end they use to get there are reasonably related. Some rational person could say they're reasonably related, and of course, I say, okay. And as Mr. Markovich said, there's great deference given to ordinances and laws that they're constitutionally valid on their face, and that's the way they start out. So I wouldn't have a great deal of heartache, just from a legal standpoint, some broad acre protection challenge on the way that it's written now. I see that there's some veins of a challenge in there, but it doesn't cause me a great bit of angst. There's a level of scrutiny that's applied to it. And I think that's probably the biggest part that grabs a lot of, but at the same time, the good or bad, the policy issues, that's why y'all are here. Y'all want the big part of the county to be able to have someone who's in control free to be able to jump out just by a parcel versus having to get 200 groups together, or 200 acres together. That's not a legal decision, it's a practical decision. This is the rationale that the folks, I'm guessing, who put this together had. We don't want every council meeting to be inundated with 30 requests to rezone individual parcels. I don't know, that seems to make sense why they put it in there like that. A lot of times that's the case for initial zonings that they're done by a group, but we've got this weird control-free district. Already zoning out of it, but nonetheless, to answer that question, I have a problem with the protection challenge. Obviously, every zoning districts are all treated as similarly. They do. Generally saying that the rules that are applicable to zoning districts have to be applied in a uniform fashion. As you lay them out, you're not going to have essentially different zoning ordinances. That makes sense. They have to be treated fairly. And I get it because the way that this is constructed, that's wasn't done the most artful way, the way that it out from 32 into the Parkable. Setback issue, I suppose, certainly could be cleared up. It's up to y'all. Still gonna have building code issues that will guide and determine how people construct things. Certainly, not the setbacks, you could probably get closer to an easement. Requirements. Could get around, or y'all could get around that language or get setbacks. We'd have to do some artful language, but solving the setback, solving the multifamily problem by adding some language to the effect that, all right, this is what we're gonna do with multifamily. Painting the condos, or let's say apartments first, maybe treated as one structure, one building. They are condos, apartments. They have 6 units apartment, but we're gonna treat it as one structure, because they're not indivisible. Property lines between setbacks going around it are one. That's been kind of interpreted, it's been interpreted. That's problematic when you have townhouses with individual lot, you have decent. Not gonna have a setback between those 2 townhouses, obviously. Go that way. We could have some language to cover that instance. So the multifamily construction is made more clear, easy. Apply for a variance, which I agree. Perhaps it's not a type vehicle to get these things built. So that's another option if you don't want to do. Take some careful thought on how to make that right. That could be done, and it's my perspective, a lot of it is make it legal. You want to change things, we can court's gonna tell me. But I believe that it is, fairly good solid ground as it is. Otherwise, I think some things could be changed. Necessity, really a matter of what y'all from a policy perspective see it.
Mr. Root, let me make sure I understand one of the things you were saying, which seems to make sense if that's what you were saying. The reason we have it so that you, once you get into some zoning district, that you can't jump back out to control free is that anybody in any given neighborhood, if their HOA didn't prevent it, could say, "Oop, I want to change to control free because it has more freedom to do something that I want to be able to do." And that's why the people aren't able to go backwards.
Right,
Is
yeah,
that correct?
I guess I didn't address that one specifically. The reason why we can't do that now is because council voted that down, because we put that in front of them, and they said no. We don't want that to be in place, and the arguments, or the debate that they had, the discussion during going back to control free was the way it leaned, and it went back and forth, therefore, kind of, I thought they were gonna vote for that ordinance. We went back against it, and I think it was because it would upset the apple cart so much, because there are places that people have bought into knowing that this is the area that's zoned this way. Maybe not folks pluck out certain parcels and make them control free, that's just gonna undo things, that's gonna cause chaos and that thing. And I think that just spectator and do not pass it.
So I can see why somebody would want to go backwards into something, but moving forwards into something from control free seems to have some structural need to it, to be able to do that. That's where I keep going back to this 200 acre thing. Again, I can understand why not allowing somebody to pull back out of something is in place, but I'm not sure why we have the 200 acre. If somebody's putting themselves in a more restrictive posture to be able to accomplish a specific, such as multifamily or high-density housing. It sounds as though high-density housing is what Mr. Markovich is mostly addressing. And you're saying we've not had that issue come about to a large extent, but I could see that as being a future very important need. Yes, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
You bring up a very good point, and the point is this. You can only achieve high-density housing in control-free. There is no other mechanism in order to do it. Your highest density use in a zone district is highway commercial, 6 dwellings per acre. Per acre. You can't even build an apartment complex at 6 dwellings per acre. The only way you can do it is control-free. This is why I've said, this thing was not designed, the entire zoning is not designed around housing. It never took housing into effect except for the lakes, period. If you go back and look at your comprehensive plan, which is supposed to be your guide for anything you do with this zoning document, or any other thing to do with your planning, try and see how it deals with any type of high-density housing. It's not there, because they didn't want it there. And it just doesn't exist. And so this is our problem. Let's say everybody eventually zones out of control-free. There's no mechanism there to do any kind of high-density housing at all.
And that's where I think our issue is, moving forward, is whether it be because Clemson's coming across the bridge, or whether it's that that's the wave of the future, more high-density living. I think that's our bigger issue. And as such, I don't know that it's a 25 foot to the property line solves that problem. I think we need to make high density available. Now, I don't know how to do that. Didn't go to school for that, but I don't think it's a matter of calling something control-free or a matter of saying that, oh, control-free has a 25-foot setback. I do see that as being a problem because right now, as Mr. Markovich has said, that's the only area that you can do it is in control-free. It's almost as if we've prevented ourselves from pursuing some future objective. I think that it's more than just removing the setback requirement. Because on a farm that's control-free, sure, don't build the chicken house right up next to the property line. But I don't think that that's our real issue. On a farm, it's really not gonna be as big of a thing.
Can I interject something right there? DHEC regulates that completely. So we don't have to worry about these setbacks as far as chicken houses or anything. DHEC tells you exactly
But
where.
as far as
setbacks.
somebody's house or somebody's garage or somebody's workshop or whatever, going right up next to the property, I don't think is a big issue on a farm. But it's definitely a big issue if you have drip line housing where you own the drip line and now you've got to be 10 feet away from this house and 10 feet away, now you're really 20 foot away from the next guy. And you're right, if you're only getting 6 houses per acre, we're definitely not in a high density or affordable housing type program.
You're right. You said it was confusing, and I'm confused. But we talked about control-free general use district, and we took that off the table months ago because if we went back to the county and said, we're gonna rename control-free general use district, we'd have a riot up here, even though we're not changing anything. So I think we should probably, I think control-free is a horrible name for this zoning district. It's an oxymoron to me. But that's what we have, so let's, to me, keep it control-free. I think as a business-friendly county, anytime somebody wants to build an apartment building or a condo or a townhouse, they shouldn't have to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So I think that's what we need to fix first. The 200 acres, I don't have my brain wrapped around that one. But if somebody wants to come and build an apartment building, townhouse, condo, to me, I think that could all be done under one pretty simple thing to alleviate, we need to fix that. And I don't know what the legal way to fix that, but we can't, if somebody wants to come in and invest a lot of money and build multifamily, we'll call it multifamily, we got to fix that because it's wrong right now. Because, where are they going to go? They're going to go to Anderson, Pickens, Greenville, where they don't have to go through an appeals process to beg to build something. They're going to go where it's, they don't have to go through months and months of appeals and, that kind of stuff. So that's, I think a fixable thing pretty easily. And again, I don't know if that, eliminating the setbacks fixes that, but that's what we need you to direct, to me, in my opinion, direct us in how to get rid of, so if I want to build an apartment complex and control-free, I can build it without having to go through the Board of Zoning. And I've been to a Board of Zoning Appeals meeting, and it's not sometimes the prettiest thing in the world. So, I think that's what we should concentrate on. I think we're mixing these two things, and they are, they're related, but I think they're also separate. So let's take care of business. Let's encourage business. Let's encourage investment. That's why I'm sitting here. And so let's fix that. And the 200 acre thing probably just needs to be, I didn't see the 200 acres until you page down a little farther where it's only control free to 200 acres minimum. And that, to me, seems a little bit ridiculous, on the, face of it, but there might be a good reason to keep the 200 acres. I don't know. But I say, let's fix the problem. We got a problem, let's fix the problem, in my opinion.
To continue with what Mr. Kisker was saying, I think it's not just apartments. Again, I think it's high-density housing, whether that's, we see it in communities all over where people are trying to put 1,600 or 1,800 square feet, and then 5 or 6 feet between walls and another 1,600 to 1,800 square foot home, in a park-like, high-density environment. So think in terms of that when we're coming up with something. Now, the other thing is we aren't controlling the cities, and the cities already have some level of high-density housing, even though theirs is still a little awkward. And that's why I'm saying, well, I might not be able to see a big apartment building going up somewhere in the county. I could see high-density housing going up in lots of places, so. I think the 200 needs to be addressed too, but I think we're backing into it if we address the 200 and if we address the setbacks. We're backing into the real issue rather than taking the issue head on.
And my only comment is, when I started teaching school, there was 2.3 billion people on this planet. And it's not quite been 40 years since that day, and there's now 7, and they're forecasting 9. So if we don't come up with a way to house those people, we're making a serious mistake. We're not planning. We're not doing our job, which is to plan, not react, not think back over what happened 200 years ago or what has happened over 200 years, but to plan to take care of the needs of the county. I don't want to see anything that is control-free looked at as, woohoo, I can put all the high-density housing I want to on this. Even if it's, even if the front wall of the apartment complex is within 3 inches of the main road. So I agree. I think that we need to look at this as a problem and say, what can we do if we have to come up with our own, with a whole section in this that says multifamily or high-density housing requirements? And say, if it's a multifamily thing, if it's whatever zone it's in, these are the setbacks no longer apply, because you can't have setbacks in a house that's attached wall to wall to wall to wall to wall. And address the needs of multifamily and high-density housing as a separate issue, because it's obviously we need it, and if we're gonna plan, we don't need to be looking at yesterday. We need to be looking at 10 years from now, not next year or the year after that. 10 years from now. Or we're not planning. So, is that possible to do? Can you find some laws out there where areas that are growing and expanding, that are shifting from rural to less rural, have met the needs for housing, affordable housing in particular, and bring that back to us as a plan to put into this
Yes.
document?
Before you answer that, let me kind of, again, continue with that thought. As I would see it, whether it's within control-free or whether it's in rural residential or whether it's in some other area, it seems like there could be language that says, if dealing with high density, X number of units per acre or up to X number of units per acre, whatever language you want to apply it to, if it's for this use, then X, Y, Z are not applicable within this zone, or this zone,
And I think
including control-free.
We talked about that at one time, and it kind of got pushed aside, but we talked about, even on the lake, you could do something, not, okay, you know where we're going here. But, even in areas where it's not necessarily desirable, and yet it's going to have to be done at some point 20 years from now, and then you put in the restrictions of, okay, we have to have so much green space, so much of a barricade, so much of a coverage that preserves your view and your scenery and the scenic, because again, if we're not planning to make it an enjoyable place to be, then I don't care how many people can live there, they're not gonna wanna live there. So, that has to be included as well, or we're not doing our job. So there's your homework, Greg.
All right, addressing two things. Homework, yes, I can absolutely do that. Growth, particularly the past couple of years, from rural to urban, is a much talked about planning issue on how to maintain affordability, how to preserve open space, make sure that you're developing in an orderly fashion and not a chaotic fashion to where you have curb cuts every 5 feet, and that leads into the corridor discussion that we'll talk about later today. So, be more than glad to bring that to the next meeting. The idea of, if I'm hearing this correctly, the main issue we're hearing is the concept of multifamily. One, something like a townhome where you have shared wall, you need a variance, which we could probably address that in code. And then two, that we want to encourage high density or multifamily development, affordable or unaffordable, that we need to have mechanisms in code to allow that, whether that's in control free or any district. There's several answers to that question. Again, I can provide opinion on one or all of them, but I'll just raise them here. The first is, what a lot of our neighbors in the municipalities do. They have a multifamily zone district. So if you think of the zoning map, single family is typically a yellow and multifamily is typically an orange or a brown. So we could add a zoning district that encourages a higher density than that 6 units per acre, that 6 dwellings per acre, so that we can have zoning that demonstrates exactly where our multifamily units are in the county. So even if you look at a zoning map, you know where apartments are because it's on the map. They elected to zone that so that they could have apartments. The second answer to that question of how do we have townhomes would be to add an exemption or some delicate language in our existing code in that section 38-9. That's where it talks about what setbacks are, why you measure from a structure. You could add some kind of language that says this does not apply to what are commonly considered townhomes or condominiums. These items are defined here in this, definition. So you could exempt those 2 units so they're not subject to those setbacks by doing a text amendment. And then that third way to allow townhomes would be to eliminate setbacks. And they have shared walls and they don't have to be set back away from each other. But again, that has other ramifications other than allowing that development to occur. So there are options to accommodate those needs in our community for affordable housing and multifamily. A couple different ways to skin that cat.
And personally, I think we're over analyzing this, or we're always thinking worst case, somebody's gonna build right on the setback. If I'm building an apartment building, I'm not gonna build it 3 inches from the road, because I'm not gonna be able to rent the apartments because of the road noise,
But if
Developers
you
aren't-
take away the setbacks, you don't know that somebody else might not put something else right on that road. If you do away with them, then just because you say you won't, doesn't mean that everybody else won't.
Well, there haven't.
Well, I think we're getting into legislating common sense and.
Well, with that said, you can drive from Clemson to Anderson and see that new development going right on the sidewalk. It's extremely surprising to me that it's from me to you, from the road, from a 4-lane road. So,
But
I
if
mean,
we're gonna have control-free, it needs to be control-free. We don't need to be adding more regulation into control-free.
I think that one of the first options that Greg said, as far as having a multi-family zoning ability, does allow somebody to go and say, I would like to rezone, and here's what I would like to rezone to.
But he has to, if we do that, he has to have 200 acres.
No.
Oh, yeah, our zoning ordinance says if you're coming out of
He's in
control-free,
but if
he
he's
has
not
to
in
have 200.
control-free,
Well, and then we would have to address that.
residential.
I mean, we're gonna have to address the 200 acres on that if we do that, because if he's coming out of control-free, he has to have 200 acres to change his zoning.
Yeah, but the people that are in where you're talking about changing some of the ones that are already there, or offering that as an option for people who currently have zoning in other areas to change over to a multi-housing zone, they wouldn't have to have the 200 acres, because they already have a zone. But I almost hate to have a multi-family district as a zone, because you might wanna have it in
Right,
an area
yeah.
here and an area there and an area.
out as a county to.
Yeah, to say, this is where you need to have.
And in a
all-
variety of our zonings, we say, single family does X, Y, Z. I've seen other counties where it says, single family, this is the criteria. Multifamily, this is the criteria.
Yeah, that's all I was
Something-
asking for,
this
was
is the
something that
criteria.
simply says, let's put in the wording delicately, or however it takes, to say, if you wanna do multifamily housing, this is how you do it. Wherever you do it, it doesn't really matter as long as it meets, as long as you're allowed to do it wherever.
And
up
then
to
you
a
can address
point you meet green space, et cetera,
Then you can address the distance off of the road versus the distance between walls.
yeah.
So we're not gonna take the setbacks out of control free. Then we need to go into section 9 and take that completely out of it, because it says we don't have them in there at all.
Yeah, because the reason that they said that they made the setbacks equal was because control-free is already not control-free. There are things you can't put in control-free. There are restrictions on it, so, and the term control-free without having anything else, I think that was why the original commission that did that said, we need to make sure that people understand there are some building codes and some other restrictions that people come in here and think, but I'm in control-free, so I can do whatever I want to, and then they start reading the codes and the other restrictions, and they go, oh, well, no, I'm not really control-free. So that we tried to put into the matrix the things that they were going to have to meet anyway, or enough terminology that they would understand there were some restrictions in it. So that was why that was done. Just a quick history lesson there. I guess I'm the only one that can do history anymore. That's scary.
Mr. Root?
But I like, if we could word it so that multifamily could be put there.
I was just speaking to Mr. Pearson's comment, Mr. Chairman. The language in Article 9 predated the language, but the first setbacks were initially put in the control-free, and then almost recently, available setbacks in control-free legislative construction deal. The latter statute is going to control specifically, if it's more specific, and also that contains general repealer language and specific repealer language, which both of those ordinances did, which stated any ordinance that's on the books is inconsistent with this one is hereby considered revoked repeal. So that's how you deal with 9. I would rather it be cleaned up, but it is cleaned up as a matter of course by way of those ordinances. It's not the best way to have it cleaned up.
Okay, so I understand what Mr. Root's saying as far as 9. Now, here's what I need to understand about the setbacks. And if we assume that this latter zoning, I want to know what has happened to all of these subdivisions that were approved with 10-foot setbacks or 20-foot setbacks. Can somebody come in here now, and if that subdivision is still in the control-free district versus being in an area where that subdivision was rezoned, are the setbacks what is on the deeded restrictions, or is the setback the 5 feet, or whatever it is that's deemed in the zoning district? Can anyone tell me that? I don't think they know.
Answer's both. They have They are subject to the zoning requirements in code. So in Article 10 of Chapter 38, those are the county standards for setbacks. 99% of the time, the covenants and restrictions on the books and filed with the Register of Deeds office has setbacks that are even more restrictive than that, say a 10-foot setback instead of 5. We expressly ask them when they apply for a building permit and at the construction of every structure, say in that subdivision, is what you're proposing in conflict with any of those covenants and restrictions which are legally recorded. If they say no, then that is beyond the scope of the county, then that is up to.
How could it be in conflict?
Okay. I think we've come to a point where we're gonna overanalyze this whole thing and go forward with it. Does anybody have any motions?
I was just thinking, if we're having control-free, it should be control-free. It should not take somebody going to a lawyer to figure out what they can and cannot build on their property and where they can and cannot build it on their property. Everybody in this county does not have a college education, and they need to be able to figure out what they can and cannot do in the control-free zone without having to have legal advice on it.
I agree.
I am not legal advice, but I do provide advice to every extent to any person who contacts the county on these rules and regulations. So it's not legal advice, it's a little cheaper than that, but that's part of my job is to help every another customer and citizen in Oconee County know these rules.
So do you wanna make a motion?
I make a motion we remove the setbacks from control-free.
I'll second.
Discussion?
Clerically, and if I may, I apologize. Can we just indicate, and I started this, I apologize. We're mixing agenda item number 5 and agenda item number 6. Can we indicate that we are skipping over agenda item number 5 and moving directly to agenda item number 6, which is the one addressing setbacks?
Yes.
Chair, you have a motion on the floor.
Okay.
Motion first, that was made, motion that was seconded, and you vote on the floor for
Right.
discussion on it.
Thank you.
So the motion as it stands would mean control-free anywhere and everywhere, no matter whether it's a farm where somebody's wanting to do their own thing or something on the side of the highway.
There'd be no setbacks, right, in control free, as the motion stated, as I understand it.
Those would be eliminated.
Fred? Yeah, before we vote on this, a very short, quick history again, because there was not a lot of people here, of why these were put in, why you recommended against it, and this would solve our multifamily issue. Yes or no?
Like some history and why I made the basis of the staff recommendation.
Yes.
Okay. The history is when it was created in 2008 through 2009, when zoning was adopted in Oconee County. The control-free district did not have setback requirements. Those did not come into effect until 2015, I believe it was mid-2015, to create a uniform 25-foot front setback, 5 side setback, and 10 rear setback. Around the time that I began employment with Oconee County, we had expressed both through people who've been in attendance here, commissioners and myself, but through permitting, found that there are subdivisions, most notable examples are on Lake Hartwell, where, say our density requirement's half acre for a parcel. Well, there are parcels much smaller than that in that area, basically maximizing the number of lots that can be placed along the lake. They're not going to fit 25-foot front setbacks on some of those lots. So staff had proposed, a more sliding scale that for those smaller lots, they could have less setback requirements. Now, they still would have them, they would just be less restrictive, so that, the larger lots still have the normal setback requirements that most of the other districts in our community do, on that 25, 5, and 10, but those smaller lots are now accommodated by that sliding scale. The rationale behind the staff opinion is simply that, one, we feel that this sliding scale has been effective in accommodating those building permits. B, it acknowledges that there are typically, say a drainage easement or a utility easement on the side of the property in particular where that 5 feet is appropriate. There's also building codes about firewalls and other things that, yes, would also create a setback, but are addressed in this as well. And just the third is that status quo is typically easier than, changing things. There are unintended consequences from changes. So to remove all setbacks in the control-free district, which is 80% of our county, I'm sure will have a pretty significant effect by that change. Not to say that somebody will do something they're not supposed to do, but by removing setbacks completely from 80% of the county, when we finally just got adapted to this idea, if we have, we'll put it this way, if we had people come in and protest against setbacks and say that it harms their community and they don't want it, I would be more willing to listen, but we haven't had those comments yet, so I would like to receive some more feedback, perhaps, on that issue, or have some more discussion on the issue before recommending removing something we've had.
I think I think when we're thinking about this, we're thinking somebody that is dealing with land or acreage or otherwise, but this also applies to the person that's got 1/3 of an acre and their house on it, and somebody comes in and builds a welding shop on the property line right next door, and now there's not even a space enough to put a hedgerow up to create a barrier.
Tom?
It may help clear something up, okay? First of all, let's understand, when we inserted the setbacks in 38, we took them out of 32, okay? We already had setback requirements, so if you were subdividing a piece of property, creating a subdivision, okay? We already had setbacks, 10 foot on sidelines, and the other 25, and it was a greater in the back. And so, I mean, those setback requirements were already there. Properties were already being built under those conditions. But when we removed them, we took them out of the subdivision ordinance. And I guess I'm not saying that we should just totally do away with setbacks, because we've been dealing with those for quite some time. Put them back in 32 where they were always there for the subdivision. So if you go in and create a new subdivision, you're bound by these setbacks, and you create these. And this is why I asked the question, what's going to prevail, the zoning requirement at 5 foot, or all these subdivisions that were created with 10-foot setbacks? And so, I mean, we've been dealing with that since 2002. That we've been putting these setbacks into. And some of the private subdivisions, we've been dealing with setbacks even longer than that. But it became county law, when we created a subdivision in 2002. And that's why we inserted the caveat when we moved the setbacks out of 32 and put them in 38. It had to come back, the part that got added late in 2016 and actually wasn't approved until this year, was the language in there that says if a property was platted before 2002, these setback requirements basically don't apply to it, because Port Bass, we got 20-foot wide lots in Port Bass. Even with 5 feet on, how do you build a 10-foot house? I've been in building a long time, pretty tough. Won't even meet the minimum building code. So, that's part of the history. And this is, I'm not suggesting we get rid of the put them back where they were, put them back in the subdivision ordinance. We always had to deal with them there. That's where the problem has arisen, is moving it from the subdivision ordinance and into the zoning document, and it's just messed up everything.
Well, do we not put it in the zoning ordinance though, because that is the place that most people look at first as to, okay, I'm in control free, what can I do? And they look there, and without even having to look at codes and know where any easements or power lines or what, all the other things that might come into play, they saw, okay, I automatically need to move at least a little bit off this property line. And then once the builder was looking at the plan or whatever, they would know, okay, yes, we have to have this, we have to have that. And the owner already had wrapped his head around the fact that it couldn't go exactly where he wanted it on the property line. I think that, in all those meetings that we went over all that, and I don't care if you put it back in the subdivision thing, it doesn't matter to me. We were trying to get it to the point that it was just one place for people to look. As, you know, because like me, I'm not gonna go look in a subdivision ordinance, because I'm not gonna build a subdivision, you know? But at living out there, if we wanted to build something, we might go, okay, what do we need to plan for? Where can we put it? And that was why we put it there. That was exactly why we moved it.
And then we're gonna wrap this up.
Unfortunately, you can become a developer without even being in the intent of becoming a developer because of the way the laws are structured and what it takes to create a subdivision. And in fact, you could have a piece of property that goes through probate because you don't have a will in the family, and it gets subdivided into 6 different properties, and all of a sudden, you just subdivided a piece of property and you are a development, whether you like it or not.
That final note, back to that original question, about history and recommendation. I think Gwen put it well when she said, you know, was our intent when it was created, this is what we were thinking when it was created, this is what people who'd come together were thinking when those came into place. I wasn't employed at that time with Oconee County. It wasn't my recommendation to add setbacks. I'm not married to it, but I think you all should consider why it was put in place and who wanted it when thinking about removing it.
Control free is the only area that has it. Does all the rest of the zoning, agriculture, all that, they all have setbacks?
Every zoning district has setbacks.
And if we add the multifamily part like they were talking about, that'll solve that problem. We could still have this in there, right?
We could solve the problem, yeah, regardless. A couple of the ways I mentioned, and if that's the intent, is to make sure that people can build these multifamily units that you described, and there's several avenues to do so.
I mean, these setbacks are not that restrictive. I mean, and most people are concerned about side setbacks and front setbacks. Side setback is 5 feet. That's state law unless you get into firewalls. So, again, you know, I think, you know, I don't want to, I think we're making this way more confusing than it really is. And again, I don't want to say, yeah, let's throw this out, and then we create another set of, and I don't know how many times this has come up since this has been implemented. Is this, I mean, is this a twice a year thing, twice a month thing? Is this solving problems, or is it creating more problems, you know, with permitting?
We check setbacks with every building permit. You know, sometimes we have to tell them to move it back a little bit further, but 9 times out of 10 they do.
But I think, you know, if throwing this out solves the multifamily issue, then let's throw it out. If we can keep setbacks, keep everybody happy, and solve the multifamily issue, then I think we should go that direction. But if that's gonna be, you know, a 6-month ordeal to solve multifamily, then let's throw this out and deal with ramifications later. I don't know. I mean, that's probably where I defer to Mr. Root of the best way to approach solving the multifamily permit issue.
we can be solved in just a few minutes.
I had a instance, we have two pieces of property, they're deeded separate, but they're both in both of our names. We were building a shop. We wanted to build it at the edge of the pasture. Well, the pasture fence is property line. Well, we couldn't put that shop within, because the shop was gonna be facing towards the road, we had to be 25 feet off that fence. Because that's where the actual property line is, even though we own the other piece of property. Without going through all of that, we couldn't move our shop where we wanted to move our shop. That's an undue burden, I believe, on somebody. You know, they own that entire piece of property. They should be able to do what they want to with it. It's uncontrolled. That's the point of the uncontrolled district.
We have a motion.
Just remind y'all, you'll have a.
Motion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wrapping up the debate on that, Mr. Kisser's comment, we can do it either way. I'm not sure of everything that's gonna unravel if you take out all of the setbacks, and there may not be anything, really.
Moving up to the subdivision, chapter 32 provisions,
I understand how that makes sense for subdivision.
that you can subdivide and become a developer very easily. Mine, this way, is to have this is for the multifamily, not for the issue here, just for multifamily, high-density type development, is to write in a provision that's gonna address those specifically. That's
Not the way I like to do it necessarily, because it's hitting this one issue, and I know that we've got a lot of times that this ordinance, all of our ordinances don't read well, because we hit one little issue here, one little issue there, and they don't blend in concert. But for mine, the easiest way would be to do that, because I don't know all the fallout from just wiping the setbacks off. But that doesn't take into account the just land use freedom questions that you're talking about, control free. And so that goes back to a decision that works best for y'all. As for the timing of it, we can do an ordinance doing either one of them for the next time for y'all to contemplate. So it's not a matter of timing. I'll look over it and say yay or nay to whichever ordinance you want us to draft. And then, of course, it goes on to council, and they have to have their three readings. Ultimate time is gonna be different.
But that would solve our concern immediately and be able to, as your comment was, be business friendly.
Sure. Does, in moving this back to 32 solves the multifamily issue?
And that one I hadn't contemplated. I mean, it would, it could. It depends on how we draft it. But yeah, I mean, the goal is, I know that's the paramount goal that I've heard for a while. Solve that issue, and I know that's the one we gotta solve. So whatever take out of this, but I think it'd be good for us to bring back something for y'all that addresses the issue. Setbacks, and that's kind of the, sweep that away, and it's short term, I just don't know, all out.
That's only addressing the control-free. So if you want to build a high-density project, you go to a control-free somewhere out rural. If it's already, you got 10 acres and it's zone residential, we hadn't helped anything. We're just saying you now build a high-density project out in a farm area, or control-free area. By removing those setbacks.
It's the majority of the property that's near the pier and High Point out that way. That would be uncontrolled, control-free. And that's where a lot of multifamily would be likely to be built.
Today.
Immediately,
Yeah.
in the near future. Yes.
I promise I'll. Sewer. You gotta have sewer for multifamily, period. That's the only way you're ever gonna get, so generally, wherever those existing sewer lines are, now, that doesn't mean you don't add sewer lines. We added sewer lines to Casto, we've added sewer lines to, Fairplay. So sewer lines can be added, but nonetheless, generally speaking, multifamily requires sewer.
along with what Mr. Markovich was saying, usually where there's sewer, somebody comes in and says, this is zoned residential now because there's sewer here. And all of a sudden, now you just took it away when you rezoned it to residential.
But if we go in with multifamily changes, then we've.
Then we've
we open
addressed
up-
that.
We've addressed that, and there's already sewer there, and we're still preserving some green space.
Are we throwing out the height restriction then as well?
No, not yet.
And the only motion that's on the floor right now is to get rid of the setback. I don't think anything, that's right.
No, I mean, that's on this matrix. That's on this matrix.
Yeah, I think that's
That's
an
countywide.
important distinction, you know, it would, in this case, switch to NA, rather than the numbers that are provided. Then height structure would still be 65. That wasn't clear in the motion, but you can amend that motion to clarify your intent on what you're trying to remove and what you're trying to keep.
The motion that's been made now, we need to go ahead and get that addressed before we can, everything else we're talking is outside of that.
You can
Motion.
amend that motion.
Okay.
The
Well,
motion right now
can
is
we
to-
do a friendly amendment, whoever made the motion, to move this from 38 to 32?
And that, tell me exactly what that would do.
That moves it back to the subdivision regulations.
Yes, I make that motion to move the setbacks out of 38 and into 32.
The motion that's on the floor, just to get rid of the setbacks, is to amend the motion. The original motion, move those setbacks in an appropriate way. I'll just add that in there, because I'm not sure how we're gonna do it exactly yet. After 32 within the subdivision regulation, so we can second for that motion and then a vote.
Second.
That motion to amend the original motion.
We need a vote to amend the original motion.
She made
To
the
the
motion
minute.
to amend the original motion.
Second.
I second it.
So we have a
Now
vote.
discussion on
now we
the
can
floor.
Okay. So all in favor? Aye.
The motion on the floor right now is to move setbacks and control free into the subdivision chapter from chapter 32. You can discuss that more if you want, or you can take a vote on it.
And by voting on that tonight, do we know that that will solve, or do we know that that may convolute things? In other words, do we have to come back next week and change it back because we messed something
I
up?
will tell you that I hadn't contemplated that avenue, so I can't make that promise. I don't know, Mr. Cordes, he deals with this every day. It's not what I deal with every day, so I may say, hey, this is difficult, but based on the fact that it was there before, I understand the reason it shouldn't be too difficult on the side of the back end. We're gonna come back to an ordinance based on this motion if it passes, for you all to digest and say you like it or not. And if you like it, then we'll revise it or trash it. If you do like it, then we'll send it to council.
Okay. So we had a second. Do we have any discussion? No, we had a vote on to amend. So is there any discussion, or we'll vote? All in favor? Aye. Okay. That was a long hour and a half.
I think I got it.
So now we can move on to number 7, staff presentation on case studies for a corridor overlay district. Staff comments.
All right. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, I'll make this fairly brief, but I could make it fairly lengthy, so please cut me off if I'm going off on a tangent. The request was to analyze the 2 case studies that were presented at the last planning commission meeting, one in Georgia, one in South Carolina. They are zoning overlay districts in these case studies in these municipalities. And the motion made at the last hearing was to basically compare these 2 ordinances to what we have now, kind of discuss what works, what doesn't, what might be applicable to Oconee County, what's already applicable to Oconee County, and what might not be politically feasible, physically feasible about some of these ordinances. So, I created a PowerPoint, which I'll go through, on both items, discussing, you know, how they apply and how they don't to the county, and what I like about them as a planning professional and what I don't like about them. So, first one we'll look at is the South Fulton Parkway Overlay District. I apologize, I'll sit down during the presentation because I have to go through the slides. This one was in Georgia, Fulton County, Georgia, adopted in 2008, well, adopted in 2003 and amended in 2008. So, relatively recent ordinance. They have, Fulton County has overlays for different roadways in the community. So what applies to the South Fulton Parkway corridor would not apply to a corridor parkway elsewhere in the district. So important to consider that when we're looking at 123 versus 11 versus 59, that consideration. So I literally went through the entire ordinance of each and detailed by section, so if you can follow along with some of your backup materials, you can see how these compare. I'm just quoting what's in the ordinance, and kind of graphically, the check mark says, yeah, that could work here, and the blank box says that might not be as applicable to our community. So this was by resolution, by Board of Commissioners, you know, we would approve it by ultimately County Council. So its intent is regulating design, aesthetics, location, bulk, size of building construction, etc. That's something we're generally trying to do with an overlay district. Reducing congestion on the streets, that's something I've heard vocally from the commission and the council on what they're trying to amend with those overlays. It talks about adequate light and open space, protecting the natural environment. I haven't heard that argument for why we need corridors yet, but those are just good general planning concepts. Promoting accepted design principles for new development and redevelopment. I think that's the key phrase here. You know, this is for things that would be proposed now for growth, not for existing businesses. And they're protecting against blight and depreciation. Not sure we're worried about that at this time. We're just worried about growth. This applies in a pretty large buffer within 2,640 feet of the center line. So a pretty wide swath of their county. I've said that we might want to hone that in a little bit for some of the districts we're looking at. For reference, on our zoning map, we have an overlay of 750 feet on Lake Kiwi. That impacts a lot of land. So 750-foot buffer is pretty significant. And this is more technical, but if any portion of a parcel is located in the boundary area, the entire parcel counts. So this differs again from the Lake Overlay District, where you can have a parcel that's partially in, partially out. As long as the structure is out, it's not subject to the requirements of our code of ordinances. So that's how that differs from ours. And this just goes into that, the 750 feet. This is, you're in or you're out based on the buffer, not the parcel. The idea that you would have some architectural review or design review board look at this, that's something we don't have in our county at time. That's not applicable. Landscaping, so pretty significant landscape buffers between not only uses but parcels. I'm not sure we would go that far. Talks about having street trees in the right of way. I know Kyle Reed in Roads and Bridges would not be a fan of that. We do not have trees in our right of way, to be clear. And it talks about specific species of trees. We talk about natural species. I'm not sure if we would go into the depth of talking about individual tree species. Talking about screening, we address that in Appendix A of our code for dumpsters. They go to the extreme of screening vending machines outside of a business. Again, probably don't want to go that far. They're talking about pedestrian paths in their codes, so sidewalks. You know, Fulton County is an urban county. We don't even allow sidewalks in our right-of-way, technically, in most cases, so for maintenance issues. So to get on too much detail about sidewalks, I think, is not applicable so much for our county. As a planner, of course, we want people to walk to their locations, typically things are clustered together, but on 123, we're not gonna require sidewalks for every parcel, I don't think. Lots about lighting, requiring photometric plans. Past places I've been employed, it requires a photometric plan to show your light output. Again, that's an additional document they need to submit with their building plans, so that's something to consider if we think that would be necessary in Oconee County. Building materials, now we're talking about aesthetics, that kind of rustic elegance feel that we want our community to have. They address that. If we're looking to go down that road, then this would be a perfect place to apply it, would be in the corridor, not in a general countywide, design review, but inapplicable to these growth corridors, you may want to have some additional design requirements. Those are codes for colors, so, putting in Adobe InDesign or whatever program exactly what the color codes are, probably don't want to go that far. We could say brown or red. Parking standards, I think that gets back into the idea of traffic, that gets back into the idea of the flow of vehicles, the safe access to sites. So I think those are all applicable to any overlay that we would have. Number of off-street spaces. In particular, it talks about sharing parking so that each land use, say if they're right next to each other, they can share a parking lot rather than having to build their own. If we have parking requirements, we should also have the ability for them to share parking and not overbuild parking lots. Talking about storing things, and sale of goods in parking lots, that's pretty commonplace, particularly around 4th of July. They address that in their code. That's either a for or against, but just being aware that we allow that now, and most of these corridors would not. Cell towers, we already just addressed this with planning commission, let's not get into that with an overlay. And just to compare how much land it would occupy and how their county looked at that time when it was adopted versus how, say, 123 looks. You can see that it's taking an area ready for growth, but not yet grown to apply these overlays. The second is in Lancaster County, South Carolina, the idea of a highway corridor overlay districts. This differs from the other one in that it applies to several corridors or all corridors in their county. They can apply this to 123 and 11 and 59 rather than crafting one for each. Again, their purpose and intent is pretty similar to what I think both commission and council are looking to do. Aesthetics of gateways, that good first impression, growth areas, and in particular providing unified land development regulations, both packaged and for a singular purpose of growing community. Their buffer is 1,000 feet wide, and that's more similar to ours in that it's either in or it's out. If it touches, it's in. It doesn't have to be the whole building, but even if a part of the building's in it, for instance, that would be in the buffer. But if it's an extremely narrow parcel and the building's in the back and the buffer's in the front, that building's not in it. And I think this was an important distinction too. The development regulations applicable to single-family housing is based on the underlying zoning district. So this CORDA is really just governing non-residential uses, commercial uses. It's not touching existing subdivisions or any subdivisions that might be built in that corridor. See, these are all blank. They have design review. They're talking about mentioning governance otherwise in the UDO. That's not applicable to us. We don't have a UDO yet. Development standards. It talks about their setbacks. Their setback in the front is 25 feet, so is ours. So that would be pretty easily overlaid to what our existing setbacks, in this case, were, depending on the passage of that motion. Materials, again, you're looking at aesthetics, the visual character of that community, so that's governed. It's talking about its visibility from the right-of-way or from the neighbors. So you're trying to, the exact intent of that design is so that it provides a good impression for people who are driving or walking through your community. But it talks about how the colors, again, have to be approved by committee. We don't have a committee to approve colors. Sidewalks required on both sides of the street. Again, we do not encourage sidewalks in the right-of-way. Talks about multifamily paths, might be kind of a compromise on some of our corridors. Maybe on one side of the street where both vehicular and bicycle or other forms of transportation could be provided, but in terms of connectivity, it's not there yet in terms of the sidewalk network, so it may not be something we mandate everywhere in that development. It's talking about a common space. So if you use so much square footage of a development in this buffer, you have to dedicate certain open space and even more importantly, public common space for development. Something to consider, a good planning principle, but may not be applicable to our community at this time with so much regulation. Access management, that's the bread and butter of what we're trying to get to with corridors, making sure that there's not too many curb cuts, that our roadways are safe and traffic is reasonable. So this talks about how curb cuts are governed by SCDOT standards, distance of 300 feet or more between curb cuts. In particular on 123, we have a median, so that helps impact it a little bit, that you can't just turn left at will. But making sure that our curb cuts aren't too close together, that's what I've heard that we're trying to avoid. This would address that. Connectivity, so the parking lots would connect to each other, so you can drive through the parking lots of other developments and exit out of one common space with a signalized light that's safe. So again, the idea of curb cuts is by connecting those parking lots, you're reducing curb cuts. That's addressed in this ordinance. Number of parking spaces, it talks about avoiding on-street parking is not permitted, but in some side streets, I highly doubt we're gonna have on-street parking on 123, so not necessarily applicable, but it's mentioned here. It talks about curb and gutter as a requirement for these developments. Again, not something that I see in the short term in our community, but more urban character has those protective curbs, particularly if there's sidewalks. It addresses signs in this code. We've put a Band-Aid on sign code, but it could use a few more changes. So it has conditions such as having one freestanding sign per parcel of land per lot. It talks about wall signs, canopy signs, other kinds of signs, temporary signage. We may not want to get into that temporary versus permanent argument as this corridor has, but it does address some things I've heard from the commission before about sign height. So right now it's governed by the zoning district, which is typically 65 feet. They have something more along the lines of 10, 15 for height of the sign. Lighting again. It talks actually about signalized intersections, how important it is to scatter those out. But otherwise, it's talking about how signs for light poles should look, how they're painted, how many lumens there are. We can get there in time, but I don't think that's an appropriate start. Landscaping, it's in the right of way. If it's in visibility, it needs to be removed immediately. I think that's appropriate language. Anyone trying to turn on to 123 on certain sections that are overgrown, you can see how that could be a safety hazard. We might want a little more aggressive language there on those corridors. Talks about maintaining vacant parcels, landscaping and establishing landscaping on vacant parcels. Corridor frontage buffer, it talks about having street trees and a certain aesthetic and a certain right-of-way between the road right-of-way and the parcel. So if you have a 25-foot setback, it may encourage or even require trees to be planted in that in-between area. That's something to consider if you're looking for a common aesthetic of your corridors, having street trees. That way they're not in the right-of-way, which current road and bridge standards wouldn't be a fan of, but they're still along the roadway, so it serves that same impact. talks about street trees in parking islands and in parking lots. Appendix A addresses this, our current ordinance does not, so we can find any kind of medium in between there to make sure that our parking lots are aesthetically pleasing, provide shade from heat island effects, things like that. It also talks about preserving trees on site if there's any father trees or any, mature broad caliber trees, about saving those. The noble goal, I'd love to do that, but maybe not the priority of this ordinance. And finally, it gives a little bit of leeway for industrial districts. So we have some pretty prominent businesses on places like Highway 11 or on 123. Largely, they're a box, they're a large box. And some of these architectural goals that we have are trying to break up that facade, make it look a little more visually interesting. This provides some leeway for those large boxes of industrial. It says, they're providing a pretty big impact on the community. They can have a little more bland architectural style based on their location. And it gives them some leeway on parking as well. As far as off-street parking, can be closer to the front because there's so much parking required rather than in the back, which is encouraged for other commercial uses. So between the two, I think this one is easier to copy and paste into what we have in our community, whether it's through the idea of it applies to multiple corridors, or the setbacks are similar, or there's some leniency for existing conditions. I think this is a really good starting place to study what you would like, and not like in any kind of zoning overlay. Again, that's the idea of taking an additional regulation, an additional layer, if you would, on top of the existing zoning. So there might be control-free under there might be residential under there might be commercial under there, but they're all subject to the standards of this corridor, so they apply to the area surrounding, say, 123. And that's a fascinating overview of both of those pieces of homework that you read, you presented at the last meeting, and you asked me to compare and contrast.
Thank you. I would like to make a motion to have staff draft a preliminary plan for us to review.
Based on the check marks, I think you were appropriate in your check marks versus boxes.
Yes.
Along that, would it be prudent, we're talking about 123, we're talking about Highway 11, would it be prudent to have maps showing where we're actually overlaying and what roads?
It would be extremely appropriate to have maps.
I think that should be with that package, in my opinion.
And I'd only ask two things, and that is, please include in any of your references to trees the term native species, so that you keep things like Bradford pears out. And that we consider the fact that on White Horse Road, there have already been 4 deaths of pedestrians this year. And Oconee County currently promotes activity with bicycles. And Clemson University parking is not getting any easier. So if there's a way to provide some kind of bicycle lane, actually, I think Highway 11 is used for one of our big rides, so it might be transferable, but certainly 123, students might want to ride a bicycle from wherever to wherever. So if we can make it easier and safer for them, that might cut down on some traffic too.
Agreed.
Any other input? Do we need a motion on that? And
You made a motion.
I did make a motion, but then everybody kind of jumped in.
Tweak, and I think everyone's got what y'all can do is a little less formal than council or other deliberative bodies. Motion is made, and it's out there. 5 seconds, you just kind of frame the motion, and like you have now, I or Greg can just say, is that the motion by acclamation? Meaning, if it's like, yeah, do it. And if somebody says, no, 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 then it's not by acclamation, somebody has an opposition, so then we'll reel back and to say, all right, do we have a second, and we'll frame it more formally. So in this case, is that by acclamation, is anybody opposed to what the direction Greg achieved?
No.
So there is a.
Acclamation.
Any old business?
Chairman, if I may?
Yes.
Noting that on the third and final reading, for the proposed changes to sign control, you know, briefly, they were billboards, sign to sign, clearing up that definition and that idea of 75 square feet being the maximum sign base. That goes for third and final reading in county council tomorrow. It would be wise to have at least one member of the planning commission there if the council has questions as to why those decisions were made.
Okay. Sure you'll be there tomorrow night?
Always.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll just tell them that's the way we wanted it.
Any new business?
I guess getting back to our, real quick, because I know it's on, like, getting back to our agenda, number 5. We glossed over that with all the discussion. Do we revisit that next time, or do we let that wither on the vine? The 200 acre. I guess I'll let you all decide if you want to bring that back up next time with more detail.
Chairman?
Or
And so the chairman's the ultimate kind of arbiter of the agenda, but at this point, you can make a motion for us to redraft the starting rezoning and the 200 acre requirement. And report on it. If there's more details that you need it from, I don't know. I didn't gather what those be. It seemed like it was either, all right, let's make zoning, rezoning that control free, the same as it is, and the other, which is you can do it parcel by parcel, or keep it as it is. That's maybe part of the conversation. If it passes.
I so move.
I'll second.
Okay, vote? Oh, discussion, I think we have discussion.
So you're gonna draw up one, taking it out? Is that what the motion is?
As to what that would look like.
The motion would be, as I understand it, is to direct staff to draft a proposed ordinance that would remove the small area rezoning, remove the acreage requirement. I'll just say acreage requirement, there's more to it than that, but remove that acreage requirement with that provision and bring it back for commission consideration. Move seconded.
We had a second.
well,
Vote? All in favor? Aye. Thank you. Our next meeting will be, what is today,
In this case, it would be July 3rd, but there's a July 4th holiday there. I believe we've already scheduled that would be canceled due to that holiday. However, per Pearson's recommendation last time, he would like to meet at least twice in July and schedule a new meeting to compensate for that loss of July 3rd.
What days can,
that'd be July 10th.
what days can, I mean, is out for
There was a
anyone?
conflict with the 10th, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was another meeting.
Yeah, July 10th is the Agricultural Advisory Board.
Is there another day during that week that's open?
First week of July or the second week? of
The
July?
second week.
To my knowledge, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, in fact, Tuesday, Wednesday, well, another subcommittee, I like. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday should be open. I can check with miscellaneous departments who use this chamber from time to time to make sure that they would not occupy the chamber at 6 p.m. on one of those days.
Would the 13th be open to everyone? If you could check on the 13th, Greg.
Yes, sir.
And with that, motion to adjourn.
Motion, so moved.
We're gonna meet on the 13th and 17th.
That's what I'm thinking, that's a little close together.
Hey, we want to get stuff done.
That's only one business day between the two.
Okay.
I don't know that Greg would have time to move on anything that we asked him to do with only one business day.
true. Why would you stay with the
Mark,
17th?
Just pointed out the arts and historical, forget the full name of the commission's meeting. Thursday.
So let's just go with the 17th.
We can do,
Yeah, we put double time in tonight.
Schedule a meeting for 3 hours. We almost made that one here. Yeah, we almost made that tonight.
Adjourn.